Okay, so this sound design hack video is all about distortion, and particularly what I want to look at here is some outside the box, kind of left field, not very common ways to apply distortion inside of Live. Now, we all know that Live has a pretty decent suite of distortion plugins, things like the saturator, for example, or the overdrive, or a dynamic tube. So these are all great distortion effects, and they're definitely worth a mess around with if you have not played around with them at all. But there are some kind of under the hood, fun little ways that I like to add distortion into my sounds without just using those plugin effects. Now, if you have version 9.5 or higher, when Live or when Ableton updated some of the filters in Live, they updated the auto filter, the filters in Operator, as well as the ones in Simpler and Sampler, to have different circuits as well as different filter drive modes. And we can use these, for example, to beef up sounds a little bit. And I like to do this on my drums quite a bit because they're going to distort things in slightly different ways than something like saturator or overdrive might distort your signal. And for me, distortion is all about trying out different distortion curves, different distortion plugins, different modes, seeing which color suits the sound or the mood that you're going for, and then apply that to your sounds. So for example, on this drum rack track that I have in the provided project, I've used the Kit Core 707. This is one of the Live library presets. And if we look at this, let me play back what we've got here. So we've got a drum loop, and then we've got this acid bass line. And if we take a look at the drum rack for a minute here, if we open up one of these sounds, let's go to the kick, double click on it. What you can see is we've got this kick sample loaded inside a simpler, which is contained inside its own little instrument rack with some macros set up. And what we're going to do here, let me reset that back to 0 dB. What we're going to do here is go inside the simpler that the kick is sitting inside of right now. And if you click over here on this controls tab, you're going to see a little bit more of detailed control setup for a filter that's built right into the simpler. And what we're going to do here is we're going to turn the filter on, but we're not going to actually do any filtering, not yet at least. We can maybe play around with that later, or I'll let you guys play around with it later if you want to. But we're not even going to filter it. We're just going to turn the filter on, because when the filter is on, we have access to these different filter circuits. And like I said, these were added in version 9.5, and these are pretty interesting to play around with. If you leave it on clean, it's just going to give you a nice clean filter curve. It's not really going to do any sort of distortion or coloration of the sound. But if we choose one of the other ones, any other one, let's try OSR, you're going to see that this drive dial pops up. And what that's going to do is it's going to provide you with a little bit of sort of a pre-filter drive, meaning it's going to up the volume of the sample before it goes into the filter and give us a little bit of coloration or distortion. So let's play around with this on our kick. So let's play the drum loop back, let's solo it. Right now the kick sounds pretty good on its own. Let's just play around with some of these drives. Now be aware that when you turn the drive up, you are going to be adding a lot of volume to the signal. So it's good to compensate by turning the volume down elsewhere at the output. You can do that inside the simpler, either over here on the volume control dial, or because it's contained in this macro control, they've got a volume macro set up. That's what I'm going to use today. So let's play it back. Let's start to turn up the drive. We're going to color the signal a little bit. Start to hear a little more bite now with that kick. Now we are adding gain to it, so we do want to be careful. So let's compensate by turning the volume here down a little bit. So just a slight little coloration to the kick there, but it does add a little bite and helps it punch through the mix a little bit too. Let's try some of these other filter circuits and just see if we can notice a slight difference. Solo the kick. Subtle difference there on the SMP filter circuit. A little softer with the PRD. I think I was liking the OSR. It's got a little bit of a brighter high end to it. And this is all very subjective, right? So play around with it, see what sounds best to you. There's not really a right or wrong here, but I like the kind of top end grit that's giving to my kick drum. So keep these filter circuits and the drive control in mind. Another thing I want to point out is, let's go down to this bass track and solo that for a second. And this is a nice kind of 303 acid bass style bass line, but let's add an effect to this. Now you can see on the track here, I don't have any audio effects. And I'm not going to throw your run-of-the-mill saturator, overdrive, dynamic tube. I'm not going to throw one of those on, but I'm actually going to throw a frequency shifter, which is designed to do something totally different than distort the signal. And to be honest with you, frequency shifter, it could be the subject of a whole course in and of itself, but unfortunately we just don't have time for that today. So what we're going to do is use the frequency shifter's drive control down here. Now you only have access to it if you shift it from ring mode, or I'm sorry, from shift mode into ring mode. And right now, let's turn it off and just remember what that bass sounded like. If I turn it on now, it's going to sound a little weird. It's got a little bit of a Dalek from Doctor Who kind of a sound to it. So what we're going to do is turn it on ring mode, and we're going to go down to the dry wet and just pull the dry wet all the way down. But you'll notice that when ring mode is selected, we have access to the drive, which is basically just a distortion effect control. And if I turn that on, we can start to turn up the gain on the drive and start to boost the signal into this distortion and start to change the tone. Start to grit it out a little bit. Let's bypass. And the nice thing about this too is that this frequency shifter drive will actually limit the signal, so you can see we're not going above 0 on the way out. We are making the perceived loudness quite a bit louder. So you want to be careful with that. And if you notice that it just sounds way too loud, you can always add a utility afterwards and just bring the gain down a little bit to kind of compensate. I always recommend doing that when you're distorting stuff, especially if you find yourself needing to turn up the drive value quite a bit to hear the coloration. Let's bypass these. Here was our dry bass sound, our original bass sound. Not a bad bass sound. We just dirtied it up quite a bit with this frequency shifter drive. Cool. And then the last thing we want to take a look at here is another kind of outside the box distortion, which is actually based in the impulse drum machine. And if you drag and drop a sample into impulse, you'll notice right here in the middle of the impulse we have another drive control. You've got this saturator on-off button, and then we can turn up the drive or the gain here. So what I've done is I've taken a hi-hat and I've dragged and dropped it into the impulse. Let's actually go back to the drums track, the original one. Let's just mute the hi-hat from here, and then we'll play the hi-hat back from this track down here. So you can hear what that sounds like on its own. Hold down the volume, yeah, turn the utility back on just to balance the bass sound back out. So let's go to this hi-hat drive, we'll turn it on. Let's start to pull up, solo at first. You hear how the tail of the hi-hat is coming out a lot more. We got a lot more of that kind of white noisy fizz to the sound versus having it off. Is one better than the other? It's kind of up to you. What I'm thinking of doing here, because I don't like too much of that tail, I feel like it's a little too loud, let's take the decay and just pull it down to kind of shorten the sample, let it fade out a little bit, but still get a little of that high-end grit, that white noisiness on the top or the beginning of the hi-hat sample. Pull this drive down a little bit more on the bass. So we're just applying a little bit of distortion from very different places to do a little sound design to our different components in our mix here. Let's go back to that kick. Maybe pull it up a little bit more. So this is all very subtle stuff we're doing here, but it's a nice way to add different flavors of distortion that aren't just easily available to you straight through saturator or straight through overdrive, for example. And I encourage you to play around with different ones. Compare this, for example, to overdrive. How does that sound different? How does it sound similar? Which one do you like better on your sounds? And I find that this can be sort of a fun experimental way to explore and try adding color to sounds or brightening them or bringing them out a little bit more in the mix. So try something different. Try out these different colors, these different flavors of distortion, if you will, and have fun with them. Take care.